So you have your notes out. We'll cover that now. So we're talking about the basic genetics of which you'll need this information to be able to do your project. Gregor Mendel, as we've talked about before, is the father of genetics. Remember, he was a monk. His service to the rest of the monks was to grow a garden, and the plant he happened to pick, you know, I think sometimes God uses, his hand directs people to make choices that maybe they wouldn't have chosen otherwise, but God was wanting him to discover this for other people to benefit from. And he happened to pick a garden pea, and from that we get all these things that we've learned about genetics, and we name it after him. We have Mendelian genetics. We just named what we've learned about genetics after him. Here are the characteristics of the garden pea that he studied. We're not going to study all of those. We'll look at some of them as examples. But he studied, you know, like flower color, where the flower is on the plant, what color is the seed, what shape is the seed, you know, is it smooth or wrinkled, what does the seed pod look like, what color was the seed pod, how tall was the pea plant, was it tall or short? So he studied all of these in quite a bit of detail over a number of years, actually probably quite a few years. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about in this is when in this pea plant, or in plants in general, we have self-pollination, where you have some flowers that have both the male and female parts. The male parts produce the pollen and can fertilize the female part of the same plant. Okay? So they don't need to have another plant over here producing the pollen. They can pollinate themselves. So that's what we call self-pollinating. So there are some plants that are like that. You don't have to have another plant around to produce the pollen. Then there are those plants that have to be cross-pollinated. They can't produce any offspring, we'll use that word, unless the pollens come from a different plant. Now, the pollen could come from either, they don't matter, but in cross-pollinate they have to come from another plant. One of the things that we do in our area, we grow so much corn. Have any of you ever been part of a detasseling crew? Anybody? Nope. It's good money, hard work, but it's good money. But they pull the tassels off. That's where the pollen comes from the corn plant, and we don't want that corn where the silk comes out. We don't want it to be pollinated by any other plant but what they've chosen. In other words, they control what pollinates it so that it will produce what they want. Okay, they're controlling it. But it would naturally cross-pollinate. The wind could easily blow the pollen from the tassels. Now, when we talk about, I'm going to uncover all of these at once. When you're talking about genetics, whatever you start with, that is what we're going to call the parent generation. Like in your pedigree, could be like the grandparents. Typically, though, we limit it to something that's true breeding. In other words, if we would only take a genotype where if you cross that with the same genotype, that you'd always end up with the same thing. So that's what we mean by true breeding. In other words, it would be somebody, like if we were allowing somebody who has unattached earlobes to marry somebody else that only has unattached earlobes. And one other requirement, the children all have to come out as having unattached earlobes. If they're not, then one is not what we call true breeding. Okay? Now, so that's the parent. They will then have offspring, and the next generation is called the F1 generation. which stands for first filial generation. Filial is like that children. And then when that generation crosses or mates, their offspring becomes the F2 generation. So we have F1, P1, F1, and F2. That 2 is supposed to be a subscript, sorry about that. So they're the offspring of, so these are the offspring of that generation, these are the offspring of that generation. And whatever characteristic we're talking about, like we were talking about for your project, is earlobes, is controlled by a pair of factors, is what Gregor Mendel called it. Today we, a pair of genes controls that characteristic. So that one of his concepts was the concept of unit characteristics. There's a pair of genes that controls that trait. One last thing that we want to cover yet is those traits. I mean, the expression of a pair of genes that shows up most often. Even like some of you were rolling your tongue, and there were more people doing that. The trait that expressed when two opposing traits are present. If there's a trait for rolling and non-rolling, and you received both genes, you'd still be rolling. I mean, your tongue, because it's a dominant trait. Recessive trait only shows up if you have both genes for recessive traits. If you have one dominant, it'll automatically cover up the other or mask the other one.